الضيوف الكرام، تنتظرنا 6 جلسات نقاشية يبحر خلالها المتحدثون في تشخيص واقع التلوث الذي يطال البحار والمحيطات، ويقترحون الحلول التي تعيد التعافي إلى عالم الماء في كوكبنا. ونبدأ أولى جلسات القمة مع نخبة من المصورين أمضوا أكثر من 80,000 ساعة من العمل يوثقون فيها التغيرات تحت سطح الماء والمخاطر التي تهدد البحار والمحيطات. فاسمحوا لي أن أدعو إلى المنصة كلا من براين سكيري، ديفيد دوبليه، جينيفر هايز، لورين باليستا، جيفري غاريك، وأدعو أيضا مديرة الجلسة كاثي موران.
All right.
Well,
So here we are.
yeah.
Welcome. Thank you all for being here. And of course, we're looking forward to your presentations this afternoon. But, you know, right now we're going to talk about the fact that all of you here have spent countless hours in the oceans. And you started your careers as conservationists, storytellers, and explorers. And you set out to document beauty. But along the way, you have been the witnesses of so much that is going wrong in the oceans. So, in addition to sharing wonder, let's talk about the impacts that all of you have been seeing in the oceans. And whenever possible, let's also talk about solutions to those problems. So David, let's start with you. You have been in the water the longest, you've experienced the most, and yes. Can you talk about what you've been seeing, and particularly as it applies to your time on coral reefs?
When I began a journey, in my life's journey, and it's been now 6 decades, 60 years or more, we thought the oceans were infinite. And we were so very, very wrong. They're finite, and they're very fragile. For instance, our American reef along the Florida Keys, only 5% of that reef system is in existence right now. The cover is almost gone. Let's talk about sharks. Sharks are ghosts in the sea. Ghosts. And for the most part, many of them have disappeared in almost endless bowls of shark fin soup to satisfy the needs of Asia. Jennifer and I spent a good part of actually almost 3 years swimming around Indonesia, and we saw sharks 3 times. And those were wobegon sharks. Now, if you don't know what a wobegon shark is, it looks a little bit like a very old and tattered carpet, and it lives on the bottom. That's all we saw. We're looking at an ocean that has been affected by a human population. Our human population, to give you an idea, and most people don't think this way, but since the half-century since man walked on the moon, the population of our planet has doubled and will increase again in the next years. And that, of course, affects everything we deal with the oceans about. So there's been great changes that I've seen, and there is hope, too. I mean, the one thing about the oceans being infinite is we know still, after all these years, so little about what this planet is about, this ocean planet.
Well, I think that's actually an interesting way to bring Laurent in, because I think that Laurent has probably, while most of you have sort of been surface and midwater, Laurent has explored the very depths of the ocean. So Laurent, if you'd like to talk a little bit about your experience at a very different level of the sea.
Well, I think that sometimes I have the feeling that going deeper, going down, it's like going in the past. And that's right, that the deeper I go, and the most I have this feeling that I reach pristine places. But I think it's a lure. It's just because I have no memories of this place deep down. Mm-hmm. And you know, you're like a kid in this way. For a kid, the world is the world he had in front of his home the day he born. And that's the day. So I'm not sure that we should say that there is a more safe place deeper than shallower. I think the impact is everywhere now. The most important, I think, from the photographer we are, is that we show the beauty, we show the best, we try to show the best, we try to show the worst as well. Does it work? That will be a bit easy to say that it works. Just show, and then we're going to change our behavior. We have to continue anyway. But I think that maybe there is something maybe more important than to show the beauty, the best and the worst of our planet. Is maybe, and that's much more difficult, and we don't success every time, is to show maybe what it's not easy to see. It's the mystery, the need. Mm-hmm. How we need the ocean, just to breathe, just to feed, just to live. And you know, you have something beautiful and you take a beautiful photo. You have something hopeful and you make an hopeful picture of that, and it works. But in both situations, I'm not sure that we show how much we need this place. And I know that when I start a photo project, I'm much more focused on the mystery of the place, the reason of this ecosystem, the role of these species, and maybe there is another way to impact people than showing the beauty or showing the awful thing. Maybe this other way is to show the mystery, just the mystery. How big our ocean are bigger than us, and how big is still our unknowledge, our unawareness. That's important, because that makes us much more humble, I think, to see that the most we know, actually the most we don't know.
So you talk about mystery and species, and let's talk a little bit, though, about connectivity in ecosystems. And I think when we speak about connectivity, that's where we really talk about climate change and the impact of climate change. And, you know, Brian, I know that your work has been at the intersection of so many different subjects, but you're now working in your own home waters for the first time in your career. Yeah. And you just experienced Blizzard Keenan, and a huge storm. And the studies that showed that storm was in large part fueled by climate change happening in the Gulf of Maine, in your own backyard, and your current assignment for National Geographic. Can you talk about what you're experiencing with warming?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Well, I think you hit the nail on the head, and as the other speakers have as well, that connectivity is key. I think when we think about our planet, at least for myself, you know, growing up, even when I began as a photographer, I initially saw things in a silo. I wanted to go out and photograph great white sharks, or I wanted to photograph an individual species of turtle, and I was very siloed in my approach. I was just looking at that one species and trying to make, you know, interesting images of those things. But over time, over the 4 decades that I've been exploring the world's oceans, I've seen that everything is connected, and not only everything in the sea is connected to one another, but everything in the sea is connected to everything on land. You know, this planet, likely the universe, is like this amazing machine, an amazing watch, a Swiss watch or something, that every little gear has to be in touch with another one for it to work perfectly, and nature knows how to do that. It's all very beautiful, but when we begin to remove parts of that machine, when we begin to remove little gears, it all begins to break down, and that's what these anthropogenic stresses have done to our planet. We have removed 90% of the big fish in the ocean. We have destroyed half the world's coral reefs. As Kathy said, we're dumping 18 billion pounds of plastic into the ocean every year. We have dumped so much carbon into the atmosphere that the ocean, the greatest carbon sink on our planet, it takes in more carbon, gives us back oxygen. Its chemistry has changed. It is turning to acid, ocean acidification. So we are contributing to all of these things. So we see it everywhere that we go. But yes, right now my current project for National Geographic is in my native waters, the Gulf of Maine. I grew up in a little town outside of Boston, Massachusetts. I now live in the state of Maine. But this body of water that is unique in the world, it is rich with biodiversity. It has unique currents and unique stratification because it's in a temperate zone. And it has had this proliferation of life over the centuries, but it has been identified recently as sort of the epicenter of global ocean climate change. It has been reported that it is warming 99% faster than the rest of the global ocean because of glaciers melting and introducing fresh water into the Gulf of Maine, which shuts down the upwellings of deeper ocean currents that bring in this cooler water. So that warming water is having multiple negative effects. It is affecting storms. This recent blizzard that we had is essentially a winter hurricane that is driven by warm water. In the past, that wouldn't have happened nearly as frequently because the waters are cold and storms don't get re-energized by that warm water. But it's affecting species, you know, iconic animals in the Gulf of Maine, like the Maine lobster. It's predicted won't be there in maybe 3 or 4 decades. They will move on or into deeper water, but the whole equation is changing. The things that they eat are no longer there, and new invasive species are moving in. So my story is about sort of giving visual context to some of these changes, helping readers, helping people understand what these changes mean. But the connectivity is really what's important, because it doesn't operate in a vacuum. Everything is connected to everything else. And, you know, as Cousteau said a generation ago, if the oceans die, we die.
Yeah. Staying with climate and the idea of connectivity, Jen, I mean, let's talk about one of the most iconic species that is being impacted by climate change. Why don't you tell us about what's happening with harp seals?
All right, how's this microphone working? Good?
Yeah.
Is that a good? I can't tell the feedback. So Kathy, Brian, panel, people in the audience. This morning, let me back up. I have an assignment on the harp seals. It actually started in 2011. Started with David and I going to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And the harp seals that we had photographed, 10,000 harp seals we spent a week with. A storm was coming. They were on a small patch of ice, harp seal pups, beautiful 2 to 3 week old harp seal pups. By the time our vessel, our working platform, got back to its dock, a storm swept in, demolished the ice pack, and literally killed every single seal in the Gulf of St. Lawrence that particular season. Before we even got back into our car, the harp seal pups that were in our digital cameras had already perished. That galvanized me standing in a parking lot when I heard the news from the Canadian Coast Guard. I'm glad, did you make it back to the dock? I'm glad you did. The ice pack is gone. I said, gone where? The seals are gone. Gone where? They're gone. Pulverized. An entire year class. So this morning, I took another email because I'm waiting, because when I leave this conference, I go back to the sea ice. I go right back to the sea ice. So this morning in the Gulf, I heard a storm, Brian storm, has swept up, and the ice, the weak ice that had formed with snow, with all that snow, looked initially good for the harp seals. Harp seals require ice to give birth on. They are an obligate ice species. Without it, they perish. There was some ice, the wind broke it apart. So this morning I learned that there will be no stable ice in the Gulf of St. Lawrence this season, again. So the trend is increasing temperatures, decreasing ice. A number of thousands of pregnant harp seals looking for a nursery where there is no nursery. Desperate to give birth on ice, searching for ice. So now, with the National Geographic, I will follow the harp seals out of the Gulf into a place called the Front, only because it literally is in front of Labrador and Newfoundland and better ice. And some of the seals may make it there. Some refugee seals may make it there to give birth. So Kathy, my morning started out with that email. There is no ice, and what ice has been pulverized.
So this is a nice obligate animal. I mean, is this a question of perish or is there adaptation? What's the future?
It's adaptation and migration. These seals, the harp seals, come down from the Arctic. They're an Arctic species that come all the way down in November. So they come in, there's 3 large areas that these populations go to give birth. I call them nurseries. Some scientists will call them whelping grounds. They move in, hundreds of thousands of seals. They'll feed in these ecosystems. They wait for that ice to form. Historically, you could walk 150 miles, if you could walk 150 miles, across the ice. Now those pieces of ice are 50 feet wide in some cases. And the mother seals, desperate to get up, give birth, and then a storm comes through. So what will happen in the Gulf, the more mortality, the memory of that migration declines over time. So fewer seals will be coming into the Gulf. They may lose that population entirely. As a matter of fact, scientists predict the Gulf population will actually decline to a point where it's extirpated, and they'll continue to move more north chasing ice. Now, okay, we lose the Gulf population, they move out, and they're literally chasing ice northward, which ultimately, by the way, could be good news for the polar bears at some point, depending on how far north we get. But the other little part of this, as Brian said, nothing is a silo. Everything is connected. What happens when you take hundreds of thousands of animals out of an ecosystem that is adapted for them to be there? That's a whole nother question.
Yeah. Let's switch gears. Backstage, we were all talking about the pros and cons of marine protected areas. Jeffrey, I think you've witnessed the creation of a marine protected area in Mozambique from the ground level up. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful example of how marine protected areas have to include more than just the ocean. I think we very often think of marine protected areas as a patch of ocean in which the species are protected, and it's difficult to think beyond that, especially since so often the focus of the type of work that we do is on the species or on the habitat. And my experiences in Mozambique were very much focused on the community rather than specifically the habitat or the species. The organization I work with there is called Love the Oceans, and it was founded because of the founders' experiences seeing a shark killing on the beach. And she had a very strong reaction, as I'm sure many of us have if we've ever seen photographs or experienced anything like that. It can be traumatic. And her first instinct was to blame the fishermen. And of course, these fishermen are fishing locally for sustenance and not intending to catch a shark. But if you catch a shark and the street value of a shark fin is what you would make in months and months, it's like catching a gold mine. You're not going to throw that back. You have to take advantage when there aren't other advantages provided to you. And so she looked elsewhere in terms of where to put her focus, and realized that if she needed to protect these sharks, she needed to be able to give these fishermen something else to do. Mm-hmm. And so, speaking with the community, there was a lot of fear of the ocean because there are riptides in these communities in Mozambique. Swimming isn't a common skill in the community, and so that was a first step. How do we get them to love the ocean? And how do we get them to care about the ocean? Because if you care about something, then you're going to feel a sense of stewardship and feel the desire to protect that and to care for it. And so they instituted swimming lessons for free for anyone in the community who was interested. And swimming lessons led to education on ocean conservation. And education then leads to employment. So fishermen who are fishing because there are no other options for them to work are suddenly able to be scuba instructors or be boat captains or be surf instructors or swim instructors, and suddenly the relationship with the ocean changes. And for a marine protected area, especially one close to a local community, to be successful, I think that the community needs to be a central part of what that means, and seeing it built from the ground up where the community themselves are leaders in terms of what moves are being made and what direction they're taking things. I think that is going to be the big difference long term, because a lot of the work that's being done is being done by organizations that they arrive, they try to solve a problem, and hopefully the problem's solved and they leave. And for these solutions to remain in place, the people who are going to remain in place need to be the stewards of those solutions.
Cool. Let's also talk a little bit about sort of the pros and cons of marine protected areas. And Brian, do you want to talk about the pro, what happens when a marine protected area is established, and what that means in terms of wildlife?
Yeah, so the question was, what are the advantages of creating marine protected areas? I think even for a little context, just to take a step back, you know, for a very long time now, the scientific community that studies the ocean has determined that in order to have a healthy future, in order to have air to breathe, fish to eat, commerce, shipping, all of these things that we somewhat take for granted, science believes that we should protect a minimum of 30% of Earth's oceans, maybe 40%, but at least 30%, and not just anywhere in the ocean, but the more dynamic zones, the zones that are producing the most fish and have the most life, proliferations of life. So we need to do about 30%. Depending how you look at it today, we are somewhere between 1 and 5% of protection. And I say depending how you look at it because there are different levels of protection. Most scientists, I think, would argue that the best protection is fully no-take marine reserve. That means that these places are like an investment bank. You don't touch the principal that you put in there, and you let the dividends spill out, and that's what you reap. To not do that would be like a farmer eating his seed corn, but that would be counterproductive. So you need these places where female fish can have eggs and babies and lobsters can grow, and they don't know where the boundaries are of these reserves, and they will spill out over, and then fishermen can fish, and the ocean is healthy. These zones also, of course, process carbon more effectively. So if there are kelp forests and coral and zooplankton and phytoplankton in the water columns, they're doing all of those things that we need to sustain life on planet Earth. So we know that they work, and we know that we need about 30 to 40% of them, and we are far behind on where we need to be. So, you know, there are examples. I did a cover story for National Geographic in 2007 about the global fisheries crisis, about the problems of commercial industrialized overfishing. I spent about 2 years in the field, and it was very depressing. And at the end of that time, we determined that we should do a solutions story. So I did a separate story with Kathy about the value of marine protected areas. And I ended up going to New Zealand to do that story because they, back then and still today, have a pretty progressive conservation program. And they had protected a fair amount of their EEZ, where they had coastal marine reserves. And what we could see in these places is that even degraded zones had the ability to heal themselves, that the ocean is capable of restoration if we leave it alone. I remember, working with this scientist who helped create the very first marine reserve in this place, and he told me stories about how before protection, about 3,000 people would go there a year just to fish off the rocks, and they thought that if you protected it, nobody would go there anymore. Well, fast forward a few decades, now 300,000 people would go there because there was stuff to see. The fish were there. The marine life was better than it was in the 1950s simply because they made it a no-take marine reserve in the 1980s. So, I think the message is clear that nature is resilient and tolerant to a point, but we must take that action.
Yeah. But Laurent, I'd like you to talk about the challenges of creating and maintaining these protected areas.
Yeah, of course, marine protected area is one of the solutions, maybe the solution. But there is a problem with the IMP, is what is really happening inside. For example, if I just talk about Mediterranean Sea, the place I know the best, my government is proud to say that we have nearly 15% of our coastline in marine protected area. 15%, it's great. But the reality is that inside this 15%, there is only 0.9 of true protected places. I mean, places where it's forbidden to fish, it's forbidden to cross with a boat. Only this little percentage is a true reinforced protected places. The rest, it's called protected marine area, but it's just watched marine area. And that's very important, that because sometimes it's easy to say that it's better than nothing. But be careful, it can be worse than nothing if we are just, if we just feel confident because on the paper we have 12 or 15%. So it's important to create marine protected area with big rules. I mean, everything forbidden inside, and kind of policemen take care of that. That's the point. But now the most important is also the consequence of a marine. For example, in my place, when I was a kid, I was diving close to a reinforced marine area. It was forbidden to dive there, so we just dream about this place. And we dove around, and around, well, it was nice to dive, but nothing special. Now, when you dive around this place, it's as best as inside. It's very important to keep in mind that there is what happened inside marine protected area, and there is the consequences in long term. The fact that everything go out because there is so much inside a truly protected place, and that's important. In France, it's common to say that we need 20 years talking to create a marine protected area in order that everybody is agree. 20 years. That fishermen, scientists, politicians to be agree together. Then that's happened. And then after years, when people start to say, and what about to make our IMP bigger? It just has 6 months. Because after an experience, everybody is agree, even the fishermen. So that's important to keep that in mind, that marine protected area is the key. but be sure that what is really a marine protected area.
You know, one thing that when we talk about the MPAs, it's always about this idea of improving fisheries and spillover. And I think you have all worked at sort of different aspects of covering fisheries, whether it's, you know, traditional, whether it's industrialized. David, you had some pretty interesting thoughts on fisheries and how fish is actually being used in ways that we don't often consider in terms of conservation impacts.
Well, it's something that Paul Watson once said, Greenpeace. He said, what creature on this planet eats the most fish? And the answer is a pig. About 12% of the entire fish catch in the world is used for animal food, forage food, fish food, pet food. A great river, actually, and if you look at it, it almost looks like a silver river of sardines come out of the sea every year. An enormous amount of this amount of catch goes for a secondary use. For instance, in a salmon farm. The salmon eat fish that we catch, so we feed to the salmon. And it's this strange circular business that is, in essence, completely unproductive. We have to think about when we eat fish, how much of it is going to affect the rest of the world and affect the ocean. Jennifer and I went to Vigo. Vigo is the main fishing port in Spain, and basically the main fishing port for all of Europe. If you want to have swordfish in Moscow, that fish is going to be landed in Vigo from a Spanish or Portuguese ship that's crossed the Atlantic and fished on the Grand Banks. We watched a longliner being unloaded. The longliner was a ship that was about, I don't know, 50-meter long ship with a crew of about 10. And they were unloading this ship. They took out tons and tons of blue sharks and some swordfish. So for every swordfish that was caught, 10 or 12 blue sharks were caught and piled up, and they were put in mounds of fish in the fish market. Mounds that used to be, where our friend Leo shot pictures of them years ago, were mountains. And the few catches of swordfish were lined up in the rest of the floor of the fish market. Well, for shark fishing, this is what it means. I mean, this is a population that's slowly being wiped out because one of the things that controls the amount of sharks that come in is that they have to take the entire shark. This longliner has to haul up every single shark and put it in the hold, and pretty soon the hold is full and they'll have to come in. So it's a kind of a bizarre control of how much fish that they're taking out of the ocean. But there is another thing that I saw and I thought about. Here is this enormous population of blue sharks, almost worthless on the market, except for their fins. But the big question is not the fact that this population is disappearing. The big question is, how is this ecosystem, 600 feet, 1,000 feet, 1,500 feet, 5,000 feet down, this engine of our ocean working? And the answer to that is we don't really know. And we don't know because we don't have the tools to see in the dark of the ocean. all of us have spent our lives, and even Laurent, who's gone deeper and with more vision than all of us, we still are looking at the very surface of this 70% of the sea, this 1 or 2% of what we've seen. We need tools, we need vision, we need to really look at what the ocean is. As I said, I mean, the best description is this is the engine of the planet, and we don't know how the machinery works yet. We have some clues, we need technology, and we need vision. Vision that can come from here, and maybe should come from here.
That's actually, David, an interesting way to sort of segue into the idea of ocean exploitation. Because, you know, this is where solutions get really complicated. You know, if a single wind turbine, which is a good thing, contains more than a metric ton of copper, and electric car batteries, also good, require mountains of cobalt, nickel, and manganese. Where are we going to get that material? Some people are now making the case that we go deep, we go to the ocean floor, and that the destruction of the ocean bottom will be less impactful than continued destruction of terrestrial ecosystems. But we're talking about ecosystems that we're only beginning to even understand, and yet we're talking at the same rate about destroying them. Jeff, you want to comment on that? Any thoughts on that?
I think that it can't be stated enough that our impact doesn't stop where we stop. I think it's very easy to think, you know, if you're a snorkeler, you go 5 feet under the ocean, that's the part of the ocean that you affect, or if you're a diver, you go to 30 meters, or if you're Laurent, you go to 120, and that's the end. But, and I'm sure you can speak to this as well, but the deeper you go, you talked about it being like a time machine, and I think that it can only take us back so far, because I'm sure you still see impact there. And just because our activities take place up here doesn't mean the impact of those activities doesn't have a long echo. And I think it would be naive of us to think that just because something is far away from us doesn't mean it's going to affect us. Because as you spoke about in your opening remarks, every other one of our breaths is created by the ocean. And the ocean is this enormous, far-reaching machine, and for us to think that we're going to work on a part of it that we understand the least and not have consequences the way we would have them on land, I think all we really do there is create consequences that are harder to see and more difficult to photograph and potentially more difficult to counteract. And it may just be that we delay our chance of responding to those consequences.
Jen?
Kath? I'm going to lean into this a little.
Please do.
So I'm going to steal from my talk a little this afternoon. It's easy to go where we don't know and take from what we don't know, what we don't see. If what we did to the oceans was visible, I think I heard Brian say this once years ago. He's not wrong. If people could see what we do to the oceans, how we harvest the oceans, we wouldn't do it that way. If what you were driving down your highway and looked out your window and saw that happening to your forest or your field or your, you know, something visible to you, it wouldn't happen. So, to my point, Antarctica, less than a month, a discovery made by the Alfred Wegener Institute. Okay, ice fish. Only, I don't know, 60 million ice fish that went undetected for, I don't know, centuries. It's a nursery area that stretches 5 miles off the Antarctic Peninsula. Mm-hmm. Who knew? How did we know? I am stealing from my talk. Oh well. So a Weddell seal led the scientists, they popped They popped a transmitter on a Weddell seal and said, "Go tell us what Weddell seals do." Well, that Weddell seal told the scientist, "Well, I'm going to go have lunch," and he went down, and they tracked him, and the ship, they sent down their devices to monitor his habitat. Why was he going there? Why were they spending time there? Well, they discovered a nursery area for icefish, and icefish is like 1.5 meters long, and their nests are filled with eggs, and it goes on for miles and miles and miles and miles. Now, if you set up resource extraction in that area and you don't know that they're there or care that they're there, or explore, or they're gone before we even knew they were there. This was an accidental, maniac discovery. And here we are. What happens to the ocean when we go there and we don't know?
Exactly. We're almost out of time. Brian, I want to give you the last word. You've obviously spent a lot of time recently talking and photographing whales, and people are now always saying to you, how do we save the whales? But you think that's actually the wrong mindset. Do you want to talk about that? Take us out?
Yeah, I do, Kathy, thanks. So what Kathy is talking about is, and I'll talk about this in my presentation later today, my latest project, Secrets of the Whales, which was really looking at whale culture, the fact that whales, science is showing us, have rich ancestral traditions, not so different than humans. And in a lot of the publicity, the PR that I did for that project, inevitably people will ask, well, you know, how are whales doing, or what can we do to save the whales? And, you know, my answer was that it's really less about any one species and how we can save that species, unless it's one that is really imperiled and there's something that we can do specifically to save it. But, you know, I think we have to see this much bigger picture, which hopefully is what we've tried to get across today, that everything in the ocean and everything on Earth is connected. So we simply need to have a better understanding of these connections, understand how our actions, how human actions are or inactions are having negative impacts on our planet. And, you know, I firmly believe that with good science and good storytelling, we can move that needle in the right direction.